Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. On this episode of the 2020 Outlook series, host Craig Jeffery meets with Jonathan Paquette, Senior Financial Solutions Expert at Treasury Intelligence Solutions, to discuss moving ERP into the cloud, understanding connectivity strategies. They engage in a wide-range discussion around the rapid growth of ERP migrations across organizations and banks today. Topics include the latest platforms, elements impacting connectivity, understanding connectivity strategies and plans, and options to make the ERP migration process a success. Listen in to the discussion to find out more.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. This is Craig Jeffery. I'm the managing partner of Strategic Treasurer and today's host for the Treasury Update podcast. I am here with Jonathan Paquette. He's a senior financial solutions expert at Treasury Intelligence Solutions, or TIS. Welcome to the podcast, John.
Yeah, thanks very much, Craig. Thanks for having me.
So in terms of setting the stage, what's the context and what's happening with movements of ERP systems? Just some background statements. The number of organizations who have ERP migrations planned or underway has been growing quickly in the recent months. And this seems largely driven by organizations looking to migrate to the ERP's newest platform or taking advantage of the cloud-hosted models. Oracle and SAP are just two examples of this, where this seems to be occurring very rapidly. And can you provide some additional context on this move in the ERP or integrated accounting system environment?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you mentioned a couple of the big names there in terms of Oracle and SAP. Quite commonly, we're seeing a lot of organizations that want to take advantage of SAP's latest platform, the S/4HANA platform. Obviously, some organizations have already begun that migration effort, while others are still sort of in the planning phase, sort of keeping an eye on some of those key dates that SAP has communicated in terms of when they'll phase out support for some of these legacy systems, right? And so I think a lot of organizations are recognizing that this is a multi-year effort and they want to be, sort of ahead of the game here, or at least not under the gun, so to speak, as they progress through these migrations. The other key component here is obviously the cloud-hosted models that you mentioned before, right? So we're seeing a lot of organizations on our side who are looking to take advantage of cloud architecture for a lot of good reasons, right? So for cost-saving standpoint, but just also in terms of the processing power, the data redundancy, the data security that's provided in the cloud environment is a big benefit to organizations and difficult to replicate on your own to support a traditional on-premise install. So, and also for multinational organizations, the deployment becomes easier. And also once you put data in the cloud, it becomes, easier to access for everybody in the organization. So, I think that those are definitely the key drivers of the movements that we're seeing.
We've seen, going back more than a decade, since about 2002, 2001, somewhere in there, the movement of banks to the cloud took place as they added portals versus installed solutions. Treasury systems started adopting that around the same time, and then growing and supplanting the installed solutions. Now we see it the same thing happening in ERP, so it's really hitting every area of an organization. But as we look at ERPs moving to the cloud, I'm always mindful of the complexities that organizations face. There's complexities in banking that impact connectivity. When you say, hey, we're going to move to the cloud, you still have to connect to your internal processes, but you also have to connect to external providers of information, whether it's banks providing data about balance or transaction information, sending out payments to third parties through SWIFT directly to banks. Can you talk us through some of the big complexities that organizations face as they move their ERP to the cloud? Because there's these other types of connections. Maybe you could just highlight some of the big ones.
Right. Obviously, like you mentioned, there's the bank connectivity piece that's important to manage, both in the cloud environment and the on-premise environment. And I think that, a lot of organizations are also managing, multiple back-end systems, right? So you're talking about ERP systems, but for a lot of the organizations that we talk to, that might be multiple ERP systems. Maybe an organization has grown rapidly through acquisitions over the years, and has acquired a number of ERP systems along the way. And so the migration looks more like an ERP consolidation in some senses, where you're kind of contemplating a lot of different aspects of bank connectivity. But even outside the ERP landscape, we're commonly seeing a lot of other applications that sit between the ERP and the bank connectors that need to leverage that connectivity as well. So, commonly a TMS, right, a treasury management system is an obvious one that we see a lot of the times. But also a lot of organizations are beginning to use sort of specialized modules as well, right? So specialized GL reconciliation modules that need a bank connector feed. Specialized cash flow forecasting models are becoming more commonplace, and even certain, payables applications that are outside the ERP that need to send bank files, and even, expense reimbursement type softwares commonly come into the equation as well. So in terms of managing this bank connectivity, there's a complex sort of application landscape that sort of needs to intertwine between the ERP and the bank connectors.
Yeah, despite many organizations saying we're going to rationalize our back-end systems, it always seems that the growth factor is larger than the rationalization or scale down factor. So, yeah, you're dealing with a complex environment with lots of needs for, let's say, payments or information. When we were prepping, we talked also about some threats to the payment process, the growth of cyber fraud. How do you see that in terms of adding to the complexities, maybe generally or with regard to your point about multiple back-end systems?
Yeah, so I think it's absolutely something that comes into the equation as well, right? So a lot of treasurers are managing really complex environments here in terms of, thousands of transactions moving through their environments every single day, right? So how do they sort of make sure that those processes are under control? It's, through a combination of standardization of processes and then backstopping that with technology, right? So anything that's disruptive to that process introduces the risk of, fraud attempts or, sort of security threats to the payment process as well. So obviously in an ERP migration state here, the process continuity is something that, a lot of organizations really think about hard here. How do you sort of, maintain sort of continuity of processes so that you don't have to resort to these manual process work around these sort of human intervention type aspects here that also introduce these fraud risk as well.
Yeah, excellent. So yeah, just the human handoffs or the interfaces that aren't automated obviously create points of exposure for fraud and points of inefficiency. The complexity of the number of back-end systems and then the bad actors and criminal elements who are trying to abscond with funds or compromise those systems that's a really good explanation of some of the complexities that are part of what organizations are facing. Before I get into plans, I did want to mention for those that might not have heard of TIS or Treasury Intelligence Solutions, they're a treasury aggregator providing connectivity to banks across any type of platform for information reporting, for payments. They have a visibility tool, bank account management, and some other features. So encourage you to check out their website in the notes. But just wanted to give you some background for who you're talking to with John. So John, in terms of the plans in any conversion, let's say moving ERPs to the cloud, and as we, in the context of the connectivity strategies, with this conversion, there are a number of plans that have to be put in place. And sometimes a strategy can be more in order rather than just detailed plans, which is, I don't want to call it whack-a-mole, but just handling individual items on a one-off basis, but rather how do we handle those in order in a comprehensive manner? And can you explain what you see happening with regard to these migration plans for ERP systems? What's working well and what's been causing issues? Because I know there's certainly issues and there are certainly some examples of how organization has moved past this complexity and the conversion issues more gracefully.
Right. Yeah. I think to take it, from the standpoint of the issues first, or, I guess what has become sort of problematic for organizations is managing it as you've sort of mentioned, sort of one-off activities, right? Sort of managing your migration bank by bank, sort of reopening these connectivity projects that you may have already completed here as well, and needing to sort of rethink everything from files to, testing to, everything around the sort of the connectivity aspect as well. Items that sort of become reopened here are, everything from the formats that are being used. A lot of organizations will look again at sort of what they're utilizing for statement reporting formats. Maybe they choose to leverage, a CAMT format, the new ISO 20022 format, because it facilitates cash applications a little bit better. But even so, they're still utilizing older formats like BAI file formats or MT formats in the legacy system. So they kind of have this combination of formats to manage alongside the migration efforts. Likewise, on the payment side, a lot of organizations and banks would like to use XML-based formats today, but that becomes sort of a complex aspect to manage as well, as that sort of differs. Those formats tend to differ a little bit from bank to bank, from country to country, and even in some more exotic markets, requires some regulatory aspects to be added to it as well. So as organizations are trying to navigate all these different issues, and all the banks are sort of moving at different speeds, and they're trying to orchestrate something that looks like sort of a controlled rollout here, either legal entity based or region based, it's difficult to sort of keep all these activities on track and progress towards an efficient and effective go live.
Interesting as you talk through that, because you mentioned the connectivity methods, you mentioned formats, as well as I think you were starting to hint at the approach. I mean, this idea of, if you're reconnecting, you're rewiring your house or connecting internet to your apartment or your flat, maybe it makes sense to figure out what the connectivity is, what the format is. Now that you're touching it, let's go to a newer, better, more enriched format as part of the process. And I think that's a really great point that people need to look at. Why rewire everything only to use really outdated activity? You're not going to put in a cassette tape. If you just rewired your electrical system in the house, you're going to put in what's the most modern.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit more about connectivity strategy, if you want to add to, some of the things you talked about already?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of sort of moving towards what we've seen be an effective strategy for a lot of organizations to use to manage these migration efforts, it seems like, even for organizations with moderately complex banking landscapes, there's some benefit in, looking to use a Treasury aggregator or, a specialized connectivity provider, so to speak, to sort of manage these aspects for you, right? So through this type of strategy, you can leverage the aggregators platform, their architecture, to really form these connections directly to the banks, right? And then use their capabilities, their software and technology capabilities to manage the file format aspects as well, both the the incoming statement format that we already mentioned and the outgoing payment format as well, right? So. And once this, sort of separate, I call it, siloed or decoupled, sort of payment platform or connectivity platform is set up, the organization really doesn't have to contemplate it in the ERP migration strategy, because it's the only aspect to really think about here is how the ERP systems are integrating with that platform in itself. It sort of becomes completely removed from the project, right? So you don't have to really worry about making bank connections directly to ERP systems or testing file formats on your side or anything like that. So, and from that standpoint, it also facilitates more of a controlled rollout, right? Either legal entity or region-based, like we mentioned, because all you're really thinking about here are the configuration parameters around what ERP is connecting to the connectivity platform, in what ways and what file formats it's expecting to send and receive, right? And so as you progress through your migration, you're simply changing those connectors to reflect that the migrated entities have moved over to the new ERP systems. They're now, receiving CAMT files for statement reporting, and they're sending, sort of an unstructured file from a payment standpoint through the connectivity platform. And then the provider is taking care of the creation of that XML-based payment file specific to the bank or country that you're transacting in. I think the other sort of the key benefit is that from an IT standpoint, this sort of decoupled connectivity platform also addresses a lot of the security and compliance aspects of bank connectivity as well, that otherwise the IT department might have to sort of contemplate on their own as they're establishing these connections in-house.
If there's a back-end system like an ERP and you're connecting to a single bank and you're only getting information downloaded, well, making that direct connection may make sense, right? There's only a single connection from one point to another. But let's say someone's moderately complex. They have, 12 to 15 banks they're connecting to for multiple payment types, and they're downloading information. Or maybe they're highly complex. They've got, 50 or more or 100 or more banks they're connecting to. Now, putting a Treasury aggregator in the midst there means the ERP is connecting to one point, and then the aggregator is connecting to those different banks using different protocols. They're handling the different formats that are required, normalizing those, and then passing them back, or sending payments out and taking care of the handoffs and the security. Is that a fair way of stating that, or did I miss anything?
No, I think that that's exactly right. So, what might otherwise be sort of a complex implementation to sort of establish each of those individual bank connections directly with the ERP and contemplate each of those individual file formats, both for incoming and outgoing, does sort of become a single point of entry there for the ERP system, right? So, and then the Treasury Aggregator is managing that connectivity to the banks and the file formats for you. And I think, lifting a lot of complexity out of the overall project.
So we talked about plans and then this concept of strategy, and I wanted to move on to people. People are involved in every project. So the migration of these systems certainly involves, different players. Can you talk about what motivates or drives or what are the concerns of the CFO, treasurer, controller, and maybe IT as well? What are some of the issues there, the main items that come up from the people side?
Right. Yeah. I think that it's easy to think of a lot of these processes as purely treasury processes, but there are a lot of people in the middle there within the organization that are also impacted by sort of any disruption in this continuity process or this connection continuity as well, right? So obviously the treasurer we mentioned, is relying on these systems to sort of keep their underlying transaction processes in place, right? So both the technology and sort of the standardization that's been able to occur as a result of implementing the technology. And so, their concern is going to be on the continuity of process, really having an effective strategy here where you can have business continuity so that you don't have to compromise those systems that have been put in place. Likewise, the accounting team, in terms of the accounting controller is sort of the counterpoint to that, if you will, right? So they're the ones recording all these transactions as they occur to maintain this accurate record of the company's financial transactions, right? So, and they're somewhat subject to the methods that are in place for collecting this information as well. So if they're seeing breaks in bank connectivity or, the applications that they're sort of relying on to capture this data, there's risk for them as well, right? Not recording all transactions or not maintaining sort of that accurate GL. You mentioned the CFO as well. Obviously the CFO is not directly involved in migration efforts, but he is, expecting sort of the same detailed level of reporting and sort of the flow of information to sort of be consistent through the migration efforts as well. So that includes the sort of, the cash positioning, the cash flow forecasting that the Treasury team is doing. And obviously the Treasury team relies on that bank connectivity to produce that reporting as well. I mean, I think that the CFO also at a high level is expecting, process improvements and improvements as a result of the ERP migration because it's a technology investment, right? So making sure that the individuals that are involved in those processes are thinking through better processes, more secure processes and ways to limit fraud risk, I think is important to the CFO as well. Obviously, IT has a big task at hand, just managing the ERP migration aspect, right? Just keeping that project on track. So this bank connectivity piece, as we mentioned, can sort of become a project within a project. We've seen a lot of organizations where once they realize how complex, how much there is to manage and just the connectivity migration, it puts the overall project at jeopardy for falling off track, right? So I think from the IT standpoint, the less complex it is and the more they can stay sort of focused on the ERP migration activities, the better.
I thought it might be helpful to talk about some conversion experiences, anecdotal stories about what's going on that might be either indicative or helpful for people when they think about, taking advantage of a modern connectivity strategy or maybe not. So there's a tale of two cities to some extent. So what are some conversion experience examples that maybe you can just give us a quick run through?
Yeah, so I think that, one that I'm thinking of specifically here, but it is sort of more of a common example that we see more frequently, in organizations that have already started these migration efforts, right? And they're getting further down the path here. They've sort of addressed this bank connectivity topic. And as they are sort of progressing through it, they're realizing how complex it really is, right? So how much is really involved in reopening these connectivity projects with these banks, and even some of these file format specific issues here in terms of, creating XML-based payment file formats. Does the organization even have the internal knowledge to really create those files, or, there are other strategies that sort of need to be contemplated at this point. And that's the point where, a lot of these organizations will reach out to us. They're sort of weighing their options here in terms of bringing in internal consultants or maybe using a Treasury Aggregator in the capacity that we mentioned, a few minutes ago, to sort of lift this connectivity burden off their shoulders completely in the file format as well. So in that instance, we see a lot of organizations leveraging this strategy sort of after the fact to get the project back on track, to make sure that they're still hitting those milestones in terms of what they're expecting for a rollout. In comparison, I've seen one organization in particular that I'm thinking through here has had more of a proactive strategy, right? Where they were, sort of fell into the category of an organization that grew rapidly through acquisition. And we're doing an ERP migration, but more of an ERP consolidation, really getting the organization on one unified platform, right? So, but they had an ambitious treasurer as well who was thinking through a lot of process redesign alongside the ERP migration, everything basically from the payment process through the cash application process. And, I can only imagine the reaction of IT when she brought the scope to him in terms of, okay, we already have to manage this big ERP consolidation. But we also have to think through all these different processes here in terms of the cash applications and the payment processes as well. But what she did was proactively utilize an aggregator to handle a big chunk of that project, everything from the bank connectivity through the payment file formats, a lot of these aspects that would have made it really complex to think through these process redesign aspects at a global level, right? So she was really an example of an organization where, she took the ERP migration as an opportunity to really redesign processes, but then also built a strategy around how to augment her own internal IT resources, which she knew would be scarce, and focus on the ERP migration with an external sort of specialized provider to really, put in place something that was really beneficial to the organization.
You shared a lot of really good items. I wanted to, as we move towards the closing out this podcast on this Outlook series on moving ERP into the cloud and understanding connectivity strategies, do you have any leave behind thoughts that our listeners will want to keep top of mind?
I think the key takeaway is really just for the listeners to be aware of the options that are available to them to help make this migration process easier. There are obviously a lot of factors to managing any ERP migration. It's really easy to get bogged down with some of these sort of side items like this connectivity topic that we've been talking about today. But overall, I think it's most important for organizations to try to stay focused on the ERP configuration topics. What do the workflows look like? What do the processes look like? How is the ERP being configured to support the organization's functions and make them more efficient? And for that purpose, utilizing a specialized provider like a Treasury Aggregator to manage this connectivity piece and really keep it outside of the project plan can be a key asset in really helping to keep everyone focused on these primary ERP migration tasks. There can be a tremendous benefit in terms of time savings, cost savings, but overall, I think really in just making sure that the organization is able to really think through the migration and get the most out of their technology investment.
Excellent, John. Yeah, that advice to think through the architecture in terms of a modern view towards it is vital. You've made that point quite well today. John, I want to thank you for your time and joining me on the Treasury Update podcast.
Yeah, thank you very much again for having me.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.